Chapter 2, The Demographic Structure of the Indian Society. Demography is a systematic study of population. The term is of Greek origin and is composed of two words, demos, people, and graphein, describe, implying the description of people. Demography studies the trends and processes associated with population, including changes in population size, patterns of births, deaths, and migration, and the structure and composition of the population, such as the relative proportions of women, men, and different age groups. There are different varieties of demography, including formal demography, which is largely quantitative field, and social demography, which focuses on the social, economic, or political aspects of population. All demographic studies are based on processes of counting or enumeration, such as the census or the survey, which involve the systematic collection of data on the people residing within a specified territory. Demography is a field that is of special importance to sociology. In fact, the emergence of sociology and its successful establishment as an academic discipline owed a lot to demography. Two different processes happened to take place at roughly the same time in Europe during the latter half of the 18th century. The formation of nation states as a principal form of political organization and the beginnings of the modern science of statistics. The modern state had begun to expand its roles and functions. It had, for instance, begun to take an active interest in the development of early forms of public health management, policing, and maintenance of law and order, economic policies relating to agriculture and industry, taxation and revenue generation, and the governance of cities. This new and constantly expanding sphere of state activity required the systematic and regular collection of social statistics or quantitative data on various aspects of the population and economy. The practice of collection of social statistics by the state is in itself much older, but it acquired its modern form towards the end of 18th century. The American census of 1790 was probably the first modern census, and the practice was soon taken up in Europe as well as in the early 1800s. In India, censuses began to be conducted for the British Indian government between 1867 to 72, and the regularly 10-yearly censuses have been conducted since 1881. Independent India continued the practice, and 7 decennial censuses have been conducted since 1951, the most recent being in 2011. The Indian census is the largest such exercise in the world, since China, which has a slightly larger population, does not conduct regular censuses. Demographic data are important for planning and implementation of state policies, especially those for economic development and general public welfare. But when they first emerged, social statistics also provided a strong justification for the new discipline of sociology. Aggregate statistics, or the numerical statistics, that refer to a large collectively consisting of millions of people, offer a concrete and strong argument for the existence of social phenomena. Even though country level or state level statistics, like the number of deaths per population or the death rate, are made up by aggregating individual deaths, the death rate itself is like a social phenomena and must be explained at the social level. Emile Durkheim's famous study explaining the variation in suicide rates across different countries was a good example of this. Durkheim argued that the rate of suicide had to be explained by social causes, even though each particular instance of suicide may have involved reasons specific to that individual or her or his circumstances. Sometimes the distinction is being made between formal demography, and a broader field of population studies. Formal demography is primarily concerned with the measurement and analysis of the components of population change. Its focus is on quantitative analysis, for which it has a highly developed mathematical methodology suitable for forecasting population growth and changes in the composition of population. Population studies or social demography, on the other hand, inquires into wider causes and consequences of population structures and change. Social demographers believe that the social processes and structures regulate demographic processes. Like sociologists, they seek to trace the social reasons that account for population trends. Some theories and concepts in demography. The Malthusian theory of population growth. Among the most famous theories of demography is one associated with English political economist Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus' theory of population growth, outlined in his essay on population, was a rather pessimistic one. He argued that human populations tend to grow at a much faster rate than the rate at which the means of human subsistence can grow. Therefore, humanity is condemned to live in poverty forever, because the growth of agricultural production will always be overtaken by population growth. While population rises in geometric progression, agricultural production can only grow in arithmetic progression. Because population growth always outstrips growth in production of subsistence resources, the only way to increase prosperity is by controlling the growth of population. Unfortunately, humanity has only a limited ability to voluntarily reduce the growth of its population. Malthus believed, therefore, that positive checks to population growth in the form of famines and diseases were inevitable, because they were nature's way of dealing with the imbalance between food supply and increasing population. Malthus' theory was influential for a long time, but it was also challenged by theorists who claimed that economic growth could outstrip population growth. The demographic structure of Indian society. However, the most effective refutation of this theory was provided by the historical experience of European countries. The pattern of population growth began to change in the latter half of the 19th century, and by the end of the first quarter of the 20th century, these changes were quite dramatic. Birth rates had declined, and outbreaks of epidemic diseases were being controlled. Malthus' prediction were proved false, because both food production and standards of living continued to rise despite the rapid growth of population. Malthus was also criticized by liberal and Marxist scholars for asserting that poverty was caused by population growth. The critics argued that problems like poverty and starvation were caused by the unequal distribution of economic resources rather than by population growth. An unjust social system allowed a wealthy and privileged minority to live in luxury, while the vast majority of the people were forced to live in poverty. The theory of demographic transition. Another significant theory in demography is the theory of demographic transition. This suggests that population growth is linked to overall levels of economic development, and every society follows a typical pattern of development related population growth. There are three basic phases of population growth. The first stage is that low population growth in a society that is underdeveloped and technologically backward. Growth rates are low because both the death and birth rate are very high, so that the differences between the two is low. The third is also one of the low growth in developed society, where both death and birth rate have been reduced considerably, and the differences between them is small. Between these two stages is a transitional stage of movement from a backward to an advanced stage, and this stage is characterized by very high rates of growth of population. This population explosion happens because death rates are brought down relatively quickly through advanced methods of disease control, public health, and better nutrition. However, it takes longer for society to adjust to change and alter its reproductive behavior. to suit the new situation of relative prosperity and longer lifespans. This kind of transition was affected in Western Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century. More or less similar patterns are followed in less developed countries that are struggling to reduce the birth rate in keeping with falling mortality rate. In India too, the demographic transition is not yet complete as the mortality rate has been reduced but the birth rate has not been brought down to the same extent. Common concepts and indicators. Most demographic concepts are expressed as rates or ratios. They involve two numbers. One of the numbers is the particular statistic that has been calculated for a specific geographical administrative unit. The other number provides a standard for comparison. For example, the birth rate is the total number of live births in a particular area during a specified period divided by total population of the area in thousands. In other words, birth rate is the number of live births per thousand population. The death rate is a similar statistic expressed as the number of deaths in a given area during per thousand population. These statistics depend on the reporting of births and deaths by the families in which they occur. In fact, in most countries, including India, people are required by law to report births and deaths to the appropriate authorities, the local police station or primary health center in case of villages, and the relevant municipal office in case of towns and cities. The rate of natural increase or the growth rate of population refers to the difference between the birth and death rate. When this difference is zero, then we say that population has stabilized or has reached the replacement level, which is the rate of growth required for new generations to replace the older ones that are dying out. Sometimes societies can experience a negative growth rate, that is, their fertility levels are below the replacement rate. This is true in many countries and regions in the world today, such as Japan, Russia, Italy, and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, some societies experience very high growth rates, particularly when they are going through demographic transition described on the previous page. The fertility rate refers to the number of live births per thousand women in the childbearing age group, usually taken to be 15 to 49 years. But like the other rates discussed on the previous page, this is a crude rate. It is a rough average of an entire population and does not account for the differences across age groups. Differences across age groups can sometimes be very significant in affecting the means of indicators. That is why demographers also calculate age specific rates. The total fertility rate refers to the number of live births that a hypothetical woman would have if she lived through the reproductive age group and had the average number of babies in each segment of this group as determined by the age specific fertility rates of that area. Another way of expressing this is that the total fertility rate is the average number of births to a cohort of women up to the end of reproductive age period. The infant mortality rate is the number of deaths of babies before the age of 1 year per thousand live births. Likewise, the maternal mortality rate is the number of women who die in childbirth per thousand live births. High rates of infant and maternal mortality are an unambiguous indicator of backwardness and poverty. Development is accompanied by sharp falls in these rates as medical facilities and level of education, awareness, and prosperity increase. One concept which is somewhat complicated is that of life expectancy. This refers to the estimated number of years that an average person is expected to survive. It is calculated on the basis of data on age specific death rates in a given area over a period of time. The sex ratio refers to the number of females per thousand males in a given area at a specific time period. Historically, all over the world, it has been found that there are slightly more females than males in most countries. This is despite the fact that slightly more male babies are born than female ones. Nature seems to produce roughly 943 to 952 female babies for every 1000 males. If despite this fact the sex ratio is somewhat in favor of females, this seems to be due to two reasons. First, girl babies appear to have an advantage over boy babies in terms of resistance to disease in infancy. At the other end of life cycle, women have tended to outlive men in most societies, so that there are more older women than men. The combination of these two factors leads to a sex ratio roughly 1050 females per 1000 males in most contexts. However, it has been found that the sex ratio has been declining in some countries like China, South Korea, and especially India. This phenomenon has been linked to prevailing social norms that tend to value males more than females, which leads to son preference and relative neglect of girl babies. The age structure of population refers to the population of persons in different age groups relative to the total population. The age structure changes in response to changes in levels of development and average life expectancy. Initially, poor medical facilities, prevalence of disease, and other factors make for a relatively short lifespan. Moreover, high infant and maternal mortality rates also have an impact on the age structure. With development, quality of life improves, and with it, the life expectancy also improves. This changes the age structure. Relatively small proportions of the population are found in the younger age groups and larger proportions in the older age groups. This is also referred to as the aging of the population. The dependency ratio is a measure comparing the portion of a population which is composed of dependents with the portion that is in the working age group, generally defined as 15 to 64 years. The dependency ratio is equal to the population below 15 or above 64 divided by population in the age 15 to 64. The ratio is usually expressed as a percentage. A rising dependency ratio is a cause of worry in countries that are facing an aging population, since it becomes difficult for a relatively smaller proportion of working age people to carry the burden of providing for a relatively larger proportion of dependents. On the other hand, a falling dependency ratio can be a source of economic growth and prosperity due to larger proportion of workers relative to non-workers. This is sometimes referred to as demographic dividend or benefit flowing from changing age structure. However, this benefit is temporary because the larger pool of working age people will eventually turn into non-working old people. Size and growth of India's population. India is the second most populous country in the world after China, with a total population of 121 crores, according to Census of India 2011. As can be seen from the table 1, the growth rate of India's population has not always been very high. Between 1901 to 51, the average annual growth rate did not exceed 1.33%, a modest rate growth. In fact, between 1911 and 1921, there was a negative growth rate of minus 0.03%. This was because of influenza epidemic during 1918 to 19, which killed about 12.5 million persons or 5% of total population of the country. The growth rate of population substantially increased after independence, from British rule going up to 2.2% during 1961 to 81. Since then, although the natural growth rate has decreased, it remains one of the highest in the developing world. Chart 1 shows that comparative movement of crude birth and death rates. The impact of the demographic transition phase is clearly seen in the graph where they begin to diverge from each other after the decade of 1921 to 31. Before 31, both rates and birth rates were high, whereas this transitional moment the death rates fell sharply but the birth rate only fell slightly. The principal reasons for the decline in death rate after 1920 were increased levels of control over famines and epidemic diseases. The latter cause was perhaps the most important. The major epidemic diseases in the past were fevers of various sorts, plague, smallpox, and cholera. But the single biggest epidemic was the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 19, which killed as many 125 lakh people, or about 5% of total population of India at that time. Improvements in medical cures for these diseases, programs for mass vaccination, and efforts to remove sanitation helped to control epidemics. However, diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, diarrhea, and dysentery continue to kill people even today, although the numbers are nowhere as high as they used to be in epidemics of the past. Surat witnessed a small epidemic of plague in September 1994, while dengue and chikungunya epidemics are since reported in various parts of the country. Famines were also a major and recurring source of increased mortality. Famines were caused by high levels of continuing poverty and malnutrition in an agroclimatic environment that was very vulnerable to variation in rainfall. Lack of adequate means of transportation and communication, as well as inadequate efforts on the part of the state, were some of the factors responsible for famines. However, as scholars like Amartya Sen and others have shown, famines were not necessarily due to fall in food grain production, they were also caused by failure of entitlements or the inability of people to buy or otherwise obtain food. Substantial improvements in the productivity of Indian agriculture, improved means of communication, and more rigorous relief and preventive measures by the state have all helped to drastically reduce deaths from famine. Nevertheless, starvation deaths are still reported from some backward regions of the country. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is the latest state initiative to tackle the problems of hunger and starvation in rural areas. Unlike the death rate, the birth rate has not registered a fall. This is because the birth rate is a socio-cultural phenomena that is relatively slow to change. By and large, increased level of prosperity exert a strong downward pull on birth rate. Once infant mortality rates decline and there is an overall increase in the levels of education and awareness, family size begins to fall. There are very wide variation in fertility rates across the state of India and can be seen in chart 2. Some states like Andhra Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal have managed to bring down their total fertility rates to 1.7 each. This means that average woman in these states produces only 1.7 children. This is below the replacement level, and Kerala's TFR is also below the replacement level, which means that the population is going to decline in future. But there are some states, notably Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh, which still have very high TFRs. In 2016, the TFR of these states were 3.3, 2.8, 2.7, and 3.1, respectively. According to the Economic Survey 2018 to 19, India's total birth rate was 22.4. Among them, birth rate was 22.4 in rural areas and urban rate was 17.3. The highest birth rate in India is of Uttar Pradesh 25.9 and Bihar 26.4, and they will also account for about half of the additions to the Indian population up to the year 2041. Uttar Pradesh alone is expected to account for a little less than one quarter of this increase. Chart 3 shows the relative contribution of population growth from different regional groups of states. Age structure of Indian population. India has a very young population, that is, the majority of Indians tends to be young and the average age is also less than that for most other countries. Table 2 shows that the share of under 15 age group in the total population has come down from its highest level of 42% in 1971 to 35% in 2001. The share of the 15 to 60 group has increased slightly from 53% to 59%, while the share of the 60% age group of 60 plus is very small, but it has begun to increase over the same period. But the age composition of Indian population is expected to change significantly in the next 2 decades. Most of this change will be at two ends of the age spectrum. As table 2 shows, the 0 to 14 age group will reduce its share by about 11%, while the 60 plus age group will increase its share by about 5% to about 12% in 2026. Chart 4 shows a geographical picture of the population pyramid from 1961 to its projected shape in 2016. As with fertility rates, there are wide regional variations in the age structure as well. While a state like Kerala is beginning to acquire an age structure like that of developed countries, Uttar Pradesh represents a very different picture with high proportion in the younger age groups and relatively low proportion among the aged. India as a whole is somewhere in the middle because it includes states like Uttar Pradesh as well as states like Kerala. Chart 5 shows estimated population pyramids for Uttar Pradesh and Kerala in the year 2026. Note the difference in the location of the wide past of the pyramid for Kerala and Uttar Pradesh. The bias towards younger age groups in the age structure is believed to be an advantage for India. Like the East Asian economies in the past decade and Ireland today, India is supposed to be benefiting from a demographic dividend. The dividend arises from the fact that the current generation of working age people is a relatively large one, and it has only a relatively small preceding generation of old people to support. But there is nothing automatic about this advantage. It needs to be consciously exploited through appropriate policies, as explained in box 2.3. Declining sex ratio in India. The sex ratio is an important indicator of gender imbalance in the population. As mentioned in the section on concepts earlier, historically, the sex ratio has been slightly in favor of females. That is, number of females per thousand males has generally been somewhat higher than 1000. However, India had a declining sex ratio for more than a century. As is clear from table 3, from 972 females per thousand males at the turn of 20th century, the sex ratio has declined to 933 at the turn of 21st century. The trends of the last 4 decades have been particularly worrying. From 941 in 1961, the sex ratio has fallen to all-time low to 1927 in 1991, before posting a modest increase in 2001. According to Census of India 2011, sex ratio has increased and now it is 943 females per thousand males. But what has really alarmed demographers, policymakers, social activists, and concerned citizens in the drastic fall in the child sex ratio. Age-specific sex ratio began to be computed in 1961. As is shown in Table 3, the sex ratio for the age group 0 to 6, known as the juvenile or child sex ratio, has generally been substantially higher than overall sex ratio for all age groups, but it has been falling very sharply. In fact, the decade 1991 to 2001 represents an anomaly in the overall sex ratio has posted its highest ever increase of 6 points from all-time low to 927 to 923. But the child sex ratio has dropped from 945 to 927, a plunge of 18 points, taking it below overall sex ratio for the first time. In 2011 census provisional, the child sex ratio again decreased by 13 points and now it is 919. The state level child sex ratio offer even greater cause of worry, as many as 9 states and union territories have a child sex ratio of under 9,000 net females per 1,000 males. Haryana is the worst state in the incredibly low child sex ratio of 793, followed by Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, Delhi, Chandigarh, Uttarakhand, and Himachal Pradesh. As map 2 shows, Uttar Pradesh, Daman and Diu, Himachal Pradesh, Lakshadweep, and Madhya Pradesh are all under 925, while large states such as West Bengal, Assam, Bihar, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka are above national average of 919 but does not below 970 mark. Even Kerala, with the state being of better overall sex ratio, does not do too well at 964, while the highest sex ratio of 972 is found in Arunachal Pradesh. Demographers and sociologists have offered several reasons for the decline in the sex ratio in India. The main health factor that affects women differently from men is childbearing. It is relevant to ask if the sex ratio may be partly due to the increased risk of death in childbirth that only women face. However, maternal mortality is supposed to decline with development as levels of nutrition, general education, and awareness, as well as the availability of medical and communication facilities, improves. Indeed, maternal mortality rates have been coming down in India even though they remain high by international standards. So it is difficult to see how maternal mortality could have been responsible for worsening of the sex ratio over time. Combined with the fact that the decline in child sex ratio has been much steeper than the overall figure, social scientists believe that the cause has to sort in the differential treatment of girl babies. Several factors may be held responsible for the decline in the child sex ratio, including severe neglect of girl babies in infancy, leading to higher death rates, sex specific abortions, and that prevent girl babies from being born, and female infanticide. Each of these reasons point to a serious social problem, and there is some evidence that all of these have been at work in India. Practices of female infanticide have been known to exist in many regions, while increasing importance is being attached to modern medical techniques by which the sex of a baby can be determined in very early stages of pregnancy. The ability of sonogram, originally developed to identify genetic or other disorders in the fetus, may be used to identify and selectively abort female fetuses. The regional pattern of low child sex ratios seem to support this argument. It is striking that the lowest child sex ratio are found in the most prosperous regions of India. According to Economic Survey 2018 to 19, Maharashtra, Punjab, Haryana, Chandigarh, and Delhi are having high per capita income, and the child sex ratio of these states still low. So the problem of selective abortions is not due to poverty or ignorance or lack of resources. For example, if practices like dowry mean that parents may have to make large dowry payments to marry off their daughters, then prosperous parents would have once the most affordable to do this. However, we find the sex ratio to be lowest in the most prosperous regions. It is also possible that as economically prosperous families decide to have fewer children, often only one or two now, they may also wish to choose the sex of their child. This becomes possible with the ability of ultrasound technology. Although the government has passed strict laws banning the practice and imposing heavy fines and imprisonment as punishment, known as Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act, this law has been enforced in 1996 and has been further strengthened in 2003. However, in the long run, the solution to problems like bias against girl children depends more on how social attitudes evolve, even though laws and rules can also help. Recently, Government of India has introduced the program Beti Bachao Beti Padhao. It can prove to be an important policy to increase the child sex ratio in the country. Literacy. Literacy as a prerequisite to education is an instrument of empowerment. The more literate the population, the greater the consciousness of career options as well as participation in the knowledge economy. Further, literacy can lead to health awareness and fuller participation in the cultural and economic well-being of the community. Literacy levels have improved considerably after independence, and almost two-thirds of our population is now literate. But improvements in the literacy rate have struggled to keep up the rate of growth of the Indian population, which is still quite high. Enormous effort is needed to ensure the literacy of new generations, which are only just beginning to be smaller in numbers than in past. Literacy varies considerably across gender, across regions, across social groups, as can be seen from Table 4. The literacy rate for women is 16.3% less than the literacy rate for men. However, female literacy have been rising faster than male literacy, partly because it started from relatively low levels. Female literacy rose about 10.4% between 2001 and 11 compared to the rise in male of literacy of 7.6% in the same period. Literacy increased approximately 8% in total. Male literacy about rose up 5%, whereas female literacy rose about 10%. Again, female literacy have been rising faster than male literacy. Literacy rates should also vary by social group. Historically disadvantaged communities like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have lower rates of literacy, and rate of female literacy within these groups are even lower. Regional variations are still very wide, with states like Kerala approaching universal literacy, while states like Bihar are lagging far behind. Inequalities in the literacy rate are especially important because they tend to reproduce inequality across generations. Illiterate parents are at a severe disadvantage in ensuring that their children are well educated, thus perpetuating existing inequalities. Rural urban differences. The vast majority of population of India has always lived in the rurals, and that continues to be true. According to Census of India 2011, still more people are living in rural areas, but the population of urban areas has increased. Now 68.8% of people population lives in rural areas, while 31.2% people live in urban areas. However, as table 5 shows, the urban population have been increasing steadily from about 11% at the beginning of the 20th century to 28% at the beginning of 21st century, an increase of about 2.5 times. It is not a question of numbers alone. Processes of modern development ensure that economic and social significance of the agrarian development rural way of life declines relative to the significance of industrial urban way of life. This way has been broadly true all over the world, and it is true in India as well. Agriculture used to be by far the largest contributor of country's total economic production, but today it only contributes about one-sixth of the gross domestic product. While the majority of people live in rural areas and make their living out of agriculture, the relative economic value of what they produce has fallen drastically. Moreover, more and more people who live in villages may no longer work in agriculture or even in the village. Rural people are increasingly engaged in non farm rural occupations like transport services, business enterprises, or craft manufacturing. If they are close enough, they may travel daily to nearest urban center to work while continuing to live in the village. Mass media and communication channels are now bringing images of urban lifestyles and patterns of consumption into rural areas. Consequently, urban norms and standards are becoming well known even in remote villages, creating new desires and aspirations for consumption. Mass transit and mass communication are bridging the gap between rural and urban areas. Even in the past, rural areas were never really beyond reach of market forces, and today they are being more closely integrated into customer market. Considered from an urban point of view, the rapid growth in urbanization shows that town or city has been acting as a magnet for rural population. Those who cannot find work in the rural areas go to the city in search of work. This flow of rural to urban migration has also been accelerated by continuous decline of common property resources like ponds, forest and grazing lands. These common resources enabled poor people to survive in the villages although they owned little or no land. Now these resources have been turned into private property or they are exhausted, no longer provide enough fish, forest may have been cut down and have vanished if people no longer have access to these resources, but on the other hand have to buy many things in the market they used to get free like fuel, fodder or supplementary food items, then their hardship increases. This hardship is worsened by the fact that the opportunities for earning cash income are limited in the villages. Sometimes the city may also be preferred for social reasons. especially relative anonymity. It offers the fact that urban life involves interaction with strangers can be an advantage for different reasons. For the socially oppressed groups like scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, this may offer some partial protection from daily humiliation they may suffer in the village, where everyone knows their caste identity. The anonymity of the city also allows the poorer section of society, socially dominant rural groups, to engage in low status work that they would not be able to do in the village. All these reasons make the city an attractive destination for villagers. The swelling city is bare testimony to this law of population. This is evident from rapid rate of urbanization in the post-independence period. While urbanization has been occurring at rapid pace, it is the biggest cities, the metropolises, that have been growing the fastest. The metros attract migrants from rural areas as well as from small towns. There are now 5161 towns and cities in India where 286 million people live. What is striking, however, that more than two-thirds of urban population lives in 27 big cities with million plus populations. Clearly, the largest cities in India are growing at such a rapid rate that the urban infrastructure can hardly keep pace. With the mass media's primary focus on these cities, the public face of India is becoming more and more urban than rural. Yet, in terms of political power dynamics in the country, the rural areas remains a decisive force. Population policy in India. It will be clear from the discussion in this chapter that the population dynamics is an important matter, that it crucially affects the development prospects of a nation as well as the health and well-being of its people. This is particularly true of developing countries who have to face special challenges in this regard. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that India has had an official population policy for more than half century. In fact, India was perhaps the first country to explicitly announce such a policy in 1952. The population policy took over the concrete form of National Family Planning Program. The broad objectives of this program have remained the same: to try to influence the rate and pattern of population growth in socially desirable directions. In the early days, the most important objective was to slow down the rate of population growth through promotion of various birth control methods, improve public health standards, and increase public awareness about population and health issues. Over the past half century or so, India has many significant achievements to her credit in the field of population. The family planning program suffered a setback during the years of national emergency. Normal parliamentary and legal procedures were suspended during this time, and special laws and ordinances issued directly by the government were in force. During this time, the government tried to intensify the effort to bring down the growth rate of population by introducing a coercive program of mass sterilization. A sterilization refers to medical procedures like vasectomy and tubectomy, which prevent conception and childbirth. Vast numbers of mostly poor and powerless people were forcibly sterilized, and there was massive pressure on lower level government officials to bring people for sterilization in the camps that were organized for this purpose. There was widespread population opposition to this program, and new government elected after the emergency abandoned it. The National Family Planning Program was renamed as National Family Welfare Program after emergency, and coercive methods were no longer used. The program now has a broad-based set of socio-demographic objectives. A new set of guidelines were formulated as a part of National Population Policy of the year 2000. In 2017, Government of India came out with National Health Policy 2017, in which most of these socio-demographic goals were incorporated with new targets. Read these policy goals and discuss their implication in the class. The history of India's National Family Welfare Program teaches us that while a state can do a lot to try and create conditions for demographic change, most demographic variables are ultimately matters of economic, social, and cultural change.